have to do that too.
Again, please mute your microphones as you come into the room. Let me begin with just an outline of where we'll be going today. If you could switch over to the next slide, Philip. We've got a good 2.5 hours today. This is a brief outline of our agenda for the day. We're going to do some welcome and introductions. We've already done that. We'll be talking about the Colorado Housing Framework from a few different angles today, from a legislative perspective, and then from the perspective of CHFA and Division of Housing and kind of what's going on. We'll then get into a conversation about federal and state stimulus funds. We'll have a little bit of a time for break before we break into some small group discussion by topic. We have 8 breakout rooms, so there's some options there for you to have conversations with your fellow attendees, as well as representatives from CHFA and Division of Housing. We'll have a time for large group breakout, and then we'll have an opportunity to break out by geographic region and have conversations around the needs and issues that you're facing in your communities. Again, we'll have a large group breakout, large group report out, and then we will adjourn for the day at 12:30. With that, we will just hop right in. We'll talk, I'm going to share with you a bit of a legislative review. Won't be able to hit everything that happened in the 2021 session, but give you a high-level overview of some important housing legislation that passed this year. It was a big year for housing, and talk about a few bills that did go through, and I'll talk briefly about some of the funding bills, but let our friends at CHFA and Division of Housing in particular get into those. Next slide, please, Philip. Just wanted to share a little bit about Housing Colorado. Housing Colorado believes that safe, stable, and healthy communities are built upon the foundation of housing. We're a nonprofit membership organization working with the housing community to educate and advocate for the building and preservation of housing for low and moderate income Coloradans. We are a unified voice of nearly 300 organizations and over 6,000 individuals across the state who represent diverse housing perspectives. Next slide, please, Philip. As we think about this session in review, the legislature decided that this was the year to take on just about everything. It felt like it was a long session with a break in there at the beginning for COVID-related protocols, but the legislature, the General Assembly, took on criminal justice reform, health insurance option, transportation funding, and much more, including housing. As we begin to talk about housing and the issues that the legislature dealt with, I'd like to start with the state budget. Philip, if you could go to the next slide. The state budget was a wild ride the past couple of years. At the beginning stages of the pandemic, it was unclear what the impacts of the economic contraction would be on state revenues and expenses. But by the end of 2020, or at the end of 2020, the lawmakers decided to take a conservative approach to trimming spending significantly for the 2021 budget. As we began to prepare for the 21-22 budget, the focus continued to be on spending cuts, and in the late fall, the forecasts started to stabilize, indicating that the downturn was not as severe as anticipated. As it turned out, the 2021 budget came to realize a substantial surplus that legislators and the governor allocated through in December 2020 special session, and with a variety of state stimulus bills in the 2021 session. Significant categories of state stimulus spending included broadband investments, relief for childcare providers, support for restaurants and bars, support for small businesses, rental assistance, funding for the Colorado Energy Office, and much more. For the most part, legislators spent these dollars on one-time investments because of a concern that the state is facing a longer-term structural imbalance between revenues and expenses. We can't talk about money without also talking about the infusion of federal funds. We have come to realize as a state, and beginning in March, and if folks could mute their microphones, please just make sure you're muted. I'd appreciate that. Beginning in March 2020 and continuing since then, there have been large infusions of cash into the state for all matters of things, including for housing in the form of rental and mortgage assistance. If you could go to the next slide, Philip. In fact, through the pandemic, over $700 million have been allocated using a combination of state and federal money for housing assistance programs. In late May and early June, the legislature worked diligently to allocate $3.8 billion, that's billion with a B, of American Rescue Plan Act money that was coming to the state. As a part of that work, the legislature passed House Bill 1329, which set aside $550 million in that ARPA money for affordable housing. We'll get into a little bit of how that has been broken out, but 100 million of that was allocated, and excuse me, something popped up on my screen. I apologize for that. 100 million of that was allocated to the Division of Housing and the Eviction Legal Defense Fund, and 400 million of that will be part of a stakeholder process that a legislative task force and subpanel will be working on in the next few months. The final thing to say about money comes in the form of the Housing Development Grant Fund. In the 2021-2022 budget, there are three things to be aware of. That first, the vendor fee revenue produced by House Bill 19-1245 was restored, which adds $52.6 million to the fund. And with the adoption, number two is with the adoption of a higher tobacco tax on the November 2020 budget, an additional $11.2 million will be added to the fund. And thirdly, the legislature did not accelerate the timing of the transfer of $30 million from the unclaimed property tax fund, trust fund. So that is still slated to kick in next year in the 2022-2023 budget if Tabor restrictions allow for that. Next slide, please, Philip. Turning our attention from money to landlord-tenant relations, this session saw an expansion of tenant rights, especially as they relate to the eviction process. The more comprehensive of the two bills that went through was Senate Bill 173, and this bill makes numerous changes to the eviction process itself, including defining the removal of a tenant from a dwelling without proper court procedures as an unfair and deceptive trade practice. A trial date must be set no sooner than 7, but no more than 10 days after the defendant files an answer. And in addition to those changes, the bill also prohibits landlords from charging late. Sorry, I got muted there for a second. In addition to those changes, the bill prohibits landlords from charging late fees unless payment is late by at least 7 calendar days, and some other issues related to late fees. There's much more to this bill, and its aim was to create more equity in the landlord-tenant relationship. Next slide, please, Philip. I'd like to highlight a number of bills that had the intention of increasing the affordable housing stock in our state. The first of these was the modification of factory built structures, allowing Division of Housing, or clarifying that the Division of Housing is responsible for oversight of factory-built structures in terms of regulation. The second of these is House Bill 21-1117, and it clarifies the existing authority of local governments to plan for and regulate the use of land, including the authority to regulate development or redevelopment to promote the construction of new affordable housing units. In other words, local governments can use tools such as inclusionary zoning ordinances to develop new affordable housing, provided there are alternatives for developers or property owners. The bill does require local governments to pursue other avenues to inclusionary zoning, such as zoning changes to promote density or permit ADUs, among others. If you can go to the next slide now, Philip, thank you. A number of bills related to the Division of Housing went through this year. Two I'll speak to quickly, but we'll get into more when the Division of Housing speaks. Are House Bill 1271 and Senate Bill 242. They both authorized and allocated state stimulus money to increase the stock of affordable housing across the state. The first 1271 creates 3 different programs at the Department of Local Affairs to offer grant money and other forms of state assistance to local governments to promote innovative solutions to the development of affordable housing across the state. The programs include an incentives grant program, a planning grant program, and a housing guided toolkit for local officials. The second bill, Senate Bill 242, expands the use of the Housing Development Grant Fund in DOLA. The funds may be used for tenancy support services, including those that target individuals experiencing homelessness, and for grants and loans to local governments and nonprofits for the rental, acquisition, or renovation of underutilized hotels, motels, and properties to provide non-congregate sheltering for affordable housing. So that is a quick high-level overview of some of the work that the legislature had in front of them this year. I do want to, if you can just go to the next slide, Philip, highlight one piece, a couple of things that are happening at the federal level. The first is the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, or I have the letters mixed up there on the slide, I apologize, the AHCIA. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation that seeks to increase the allocation of 9% tax credits by 50% over 2 years. This is in addition to a number of other provisions in the bill that I think Chris will touch on briefly that would help to spur on the development of new affordable housing units nationwide. In Colorado, one estimate is that the changes proposed by the AHCIA would help to create 48,000 new units of housing that is affordable over the course of the next 10 years. So please keep an eye out for that. And please, if you're talking to your federal delegation, your congresspeople or senators, ask them to sign on as co-sponsors to this legislation, as well as to push for its inclusion in the budget reconciliation bill that has started to make its way through Congress. We're also keeping an eye on the infrastructure bills, both the bipartisan and the partisan budget reconciliation bill, for the inclusion of housing related measures within them, including the AHCIA. I'm happy to take questions in the chat if folks have questions, but that is just a quick overview of the state legislation and the federal legislation that we are keeping an eye on. And the big thing that will be happening in the coming year will be to keep an eye on the task force and the subpanel that are trying to address the $400 million that are to be allocated in the 2022 session. And Megan, just quickly, I see your question. 48,000 units over 10 years is one estimate of what could be created by the AHCIA. So thank you. I'll keep an eye on the chat for questions, but I'll turn it now over to Chris White with CHFA to talk a little bit about what they are up to.
All right, Brian, thank you very much. And I'm sorry to sort of make this announcement. It's getting old with communicating with everybody over technology, but I've learned that I've been having some trouble with my microphone the last couple of days. So I apologize if it gets a little fuzzy or bumps in and out, but I'll just plow through here and hopefully it'll work out okay. As Brian said, my name is Chris White. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of CHFA. Next slide, please. And CHFA really exists, really for one reason, and that's to fulfill our mission, whereby we strengthen Colorado by investing in affordable housing and community development. We were created by the state legislature in 1973. Despite the fact that we were created by the legislature, though, we are not a state agency. We are not part of the state government. The advantage to being created the way we were, essentially as an authority or an enterprise, gives us the ability to issue tax-exempt debt. That's really where that comes in. The other aspect of being an authority, though, is that the governor appoints our board of directors, and we are governed by an 11-member board of directors. Our enabling legislation that was passed in 1973 was amended in 1982 to allow us to start doing some economic development financing, essentially to use bond proceeds, not strictly for housing, but also for economic development activities to help create and retain jobs for small businesses throughout the state. Since our inception in 1973 and really the beginning of our operations in 1974, we have raised in the capital markets and deployed or invested actually almost $26 billion in the state of Colorado. Next slide. We have three lending platforms, primary platforms that we use to fulfill our mission. Our largest by far is our Homeownership, or our single family lending platform. Last year in 2020, through our network of approximately 140 lending partners, we purchased and funded about $3.1 billion in single family mortgages. In that process, we also allocated or distributed almost $109 million in down payment assistance to the 10,500 households that we helped. Of that $3.1 billion, not of it, but the primary investment of that $3.1 billion was to first-time home buyers. There are a couple of key factors that we've been concentrating on. A couple of years ago, we started a Latinx community outreach effort to connect better with the Latinx community to understand their perceptions of the home buying and home financing process. We've done the same this year with the Black and African American community, and we'll get those initiatives to the Black and African American community rolled out here very, very soon. We've been focusing intently on the dramatic lack of inventory in the single family market this year. We also are trying to help solve some of those problems. We just last Thursday approved our first ever construction loan for single family construction. That's a 24 unit duplex community in Aurora. Hold on just a second. I gotta let that chat box go away so I can see the slide. There we go. And then we also have been financing and getting involved with the transfer of ownership in mobile home parks. We've done a handful of those over the years. Most recently, we helped close a transaction down in Durango where the community was able to purchase the mobile home community from its owner before it went to a corporate owner. Bear with me here. I'm just going to change my view because when the chats come up, I can't see the slides anymore. Bear with me here just a second. Okay. So that's mobile home parks. We also understand that not everybody's in the market for purchasing a mobile home, or excuse me, purchasing a single family home. So we've gotten pretty heavily involved in working particularly in rural communities on single family rehab For example, we've invested several $100,000 down in the southwest part of the state for those purposes. And then we were named in state legislation last session to monitor or really facilitate the tenant credit reporting effort, where we'll get some volunteer tenants and some volunteer landlords and create a mechanism that tenants can report their rent payments to help them establish credit to get them on the path to homeownership. Next slide, please. This slide really shows some pretty significant changes on how the market has changed, the single family market specifically in this case over the last 10 and 20 years. You can see the number of loans we've done on that first row, but what jumps out at me particularly is the median loan amount. Our median loan amount just 10 years ago to our borrowers was about $141,000. It is nearly doubled in 10 years to $279,000, just an indicator of how expensive housing costs, housing prices are. You can see our total production too, about halfway down the slide there, of $3.1 billion in 2020. We do almost 10 times as much single family production as we've done over the last 10 or 20 years. And then you see the median Colorado home price there jumping up to $415,000 in 2020 from $190,000 in 2010. It's just pretty significant. So if you look at the bottom row there, median interest rates of 3.5%, you can see how that's trended down. You can see how the population has trended up. All of that has worked together to drive up median home prices, reduce affordability, and drive up median loan amounts in the state. Next slide, please. Some more indicators of how housing costs have really accelerated significantly. Kind of look at the median incomes that we're serving. Our loan production at median incomes that are equal to or less than 80% AMI have decreased over time. Incomes at 81 to 120% have increased. Incomes at 120% of AMI or more have steadily increased over the last 20 years. So again, just another indicator of how significantly housing costs, single family home prices have increased. Down at the bottom there, you can see the Hispanic or Latino, or what we now refer to as the Latinx community loan production in 2020 was 37%. Of our $3.1 billion, a little over $1 billion went to the Latinx community, and we think that's a direct result of our Latinx community outreach efforts. That amount of production right there by itself increased the Latinx homeownership rate in the state of Colorado by 1 full percentage point. As I mentioned a couple slides ago, also, we are just now starting our Black and African American community outreach effort on our single family programs. We will hope to see a similar trend, as you see in the Latinx line there. We'll hope to see a similar trend in terms of increasing the Black and African American homeownership rate in Colorado. Fingers crossed. Excuse me, fingers crossed. We're optimistic there. Next slide. Our second largest lending platform, but the one that we're probably best known for, or is most highly recognized, is our rental housing lending platform. Last year, we did just over $326 million in financing. We're also the allocator for federal and state low-income housing tax credits in the state of Colorado. So that all amounted to just about 6,000 units. We're really paying attention now to technical assistance and our SHIP programs, our Small Housing Innovation Program. And it's not just about technical assistance, which is really matching up small developers or smaller municipalities with developers to get affordable rental housing developed in communities. But I would also say that we're focusing on the lending aspect of that as well. We're looking at transactions that are, 6 units of housing in a small community that's dedicated strictly to teachers in that community so that they can live in the communities in which they work. That is a very large focus for us, including the development and distribution of a developer's guide, and a pretty significant amount of focus on the middle income market as well. We have financed 5 transactions. We've used $13.9 million of our own cash to invest on a subordinate basis on the development of some middle income developments, which really for these purposes is defined as 80% AMI up to 120% AMI. Those developments are in Denver, Minturn, Estes Park, Keystone. We're looking at one up in Steamboat Springs right now. We're looking at one in Silverthorne right now. I think you are going to hear a lot about middle income financing going forward if you haven't already. And again, just another indicator that, you know, the residents of Colorado who earn 61% of AMI up to 120% of AMI or even more are having the same or similar affordable challenges as our residents who earn 60% or below of AMI. The Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, Brian mentioned that. That and other affordable housing legislation at the federal level is really beginning to gain traction. I suspect we are at a once in a lifetime opportunity here. People might argue that in 1986, that looked like a once in a lifetime opportunity when the tax code was amended to create the low income housing tax credit program. But what's happening now is a great deal of traction on these things actually getting approved. So as Brian mentioned, as things stand and absent any amendments that will change what's been introduced, there will be about a 50% increase to our ability to allocate 9% tax credits. Right now, the 50% test that's required in the tax code will be reduced to 25% if this legislation is approved, which will effectively double the amount of private activity bonds we have to allocate for housing, and particularly 4% low-income housing tax credits. There are a whole host of other things called for in this legislation. Senator Ron Wyden has been a big advocate. Senator Elizabeth Warren from Washington has been a big advocate, has been introducing legislation along these lines for years. But the optimism, I guess I would say, by the federal trade associations that work on this stuff is as high as I've ever seen it. So to the extent you get the opportunity to advocate and support some of this stuff, please do, because again, the traction that's being gained is real, unlike anything that I've seen since I've been doing this. So keep our fingers crossed, and we really could be in a position going forward here relatively soon where we'll have the ability to create about 50,000 more units than otherwise would have been created absent the approval of this stuff. So again, it's not done yet, fingers crossed, but let's keep plugging away at it. Next slide, please. Just some more market developments that again illustrate demand and pressures on affordability. Our total production is up by a huge factor over the last 10 and 20 years, which is just, expressing the amount of demand. But if you look at the Colorado average rents about near the bottom of that first table, that row, if you go from right to left, in the year 2000, average rents in Colorado were $731. That rose to $840 10 years later in 2020, an increase of $109. If you go from 2010 to 2020, we've gone from $840 in average rent to $1,447 in average rent, effectively doubling in 20 years. But the rate of growth from 2010 to 2020 is just extraordinary. And just, again, another representation of just the pressure on our households in the state of Colorado to be able to afford their rents. If you go down to the bottom chart, I guess the only thing I'd really highlight there is average tax credit per unit costs and how they've increased, again, more than doubling over the last 20 years. And costs to build don't discriminate, whether you're building a Class A property, whether you're building an affordable housing property. Lumber costs what lumber costs. Other commodities cost what commodities cost. Labor costs what labor costs. When we're developing and financing developments that have rent caps and rent restrictions on them, it's our industry that feels those costs most acutely. So just a visual for you on what it takes to develop affordable housing. Next slide, please. Just some more data on sort of the growth in our portfolio. What I would highlight here is median rents to the households that we serve. You can see them there for yourself. You can see how low they are. I just wanted to explain that very quickly. First of all, we still, of the 74,000 units we have in our portfolio, we still have a pretty significant number that are have available to them project-based Section 8. So that sort of averages down the AMIs that we're serving. But I just want to make sure everybody's aware that when we're developing particularly, or when we're financing tax credit developments, developers make an election about what to do. 40% of units is 60% AMI, 20% of units is 80% AMI. But in Colorado, it's basically 100% of the units that to which we allocate credits or that we finance are basically set aside for households earning 60% or less of the median AMI. It's just that competitive. So that's kind of how we do it typically in Colorado. But that's the declaration that's made by the developer. That isn't always the tenants that are moving into those developments. And so what this is signifying is that despite the whatever allocation might be selected, we are really reaching down and serving the lowest of incomes in the developments that we're financing and partnering with the Division of Housing on throughout the state of Colorado. Next slide, please. Our community partnerships are a really big focus for us that we have been working on over the years. About 5 years ago, we started an initiative with our board of directors to start being sort of more locally invested and present in communities. We called it our place-based investment strategy, which has been renamed to our community investment strategy. And the point there is, again, to connect more closely with communities so we can understand better what their needs are, and we can tailor our investments and our financing initiatives to meet needs at a more local and more meaningful level. We think this will help us meet our mission in deeper and more meaningful ways, but it'll get resources to those that need it in deeper and more meaningful ways. So you can see our team there and the way we've got people deployed through the state. We've got Margie Joy on the western slope. We've got Chris Lopez down in the southwestern part of the state. We have Jeff Owsley in essentially the San Luis Valley. And we have Caroline Tranny down in southern Colorado. By the end of the year or early next year, we will hire 2 more community relationship managers, and they will be placed in the northern and eastern parts of the states, and they actually live in the communities that they represent for us. So the blue section and the green section of the map there might get redrawn a little bit as we place those new teammates in those communities. Next slide, please. Community partnerships are what it's all about for us. We cannot meet our mission without our partners. That's what makes our world go round, and particularly our nonprofit partners that are, scraping and fighting constantly for donations and resources and revenues to meet their mission. So they've been great partners for us, and we've invested just about $1.8 million as of the middle of this month to 160 nonprofits, and much more to come. We have now developed the practice over the last couple of years of setting aside a minimum of 1% of our net income to make donations and investments with our community partners. We just recently distributed just about $850,000 to nonprofits through our Direct Effect Awards, and you can take a look at that and get more detail on that through the link that's provided there on the slide. And next slide, please. And that is it for me. Thank you for your kind attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to present to you today.
Thanks, Chris. We really appreciate that. I know there's a couple questions in the chat for you. One from Sky Tallman. Do you exclusively work with a single family production? If so, why? And
yeah, let me if I understand the question correctly, no. As I explained, we also have a very big multifamily business and a small business lending platform as well. So we definitely do not work exclusively with single family production. If I understood the question, that's the answer. If I didn't get that, just stick something else there in the chat and I'll reply to it.
Perfect. And Cindy asked, where does CHFA get the income and rent numbers from? Several counties were the same, and those don't meet the reality.
We get our data from a few sources. Census data, we use HUD data, And then we use the data from our own portfolio to put all of that information together.
Great, thank you. And there's a couple other questions that have come in. I'm just going to read them off one by one. If you can answer them real quickly, Chris, thank you. In your experience, what are the best ways for funders or financial institutions to partner or support affordable housing production?
Well, I'm sorry not to have a very sophisticated answer, but it's just simply having the resources and deploying them for those purposes. The single biggest roadblock to affordable housing development is resources. I always get a little bit embarrassed when I get asked that, because, you know, you get in these brainstorming sessions or innovation sessions about what can we do to increase supply, what can we do, and it's you know, it's resources, because because the most significant resources we have are all sort of legally or legislatively created or mandated resources, and they're all capped, and the demand for those resources has always exceeded the supply. That's just sort of the bottom line. So if other financial providers, lenders, whatever it is, I would just suggest that understanding those markets and getting involved in them more deeply, and in partnership with organizations like CHFA, with the Division of Housing and the Department of Local Affairs, the nonprofit developers and gap funders that are out there. The capital stack gets larger and larger, it seems, sort of every year or every couple of years. So to the extent that we've got people participating, or organizations or entities participating in that, you know, that's what we can do until this federal legislation is addressed to dramatically grow the resources to get even close to meeting the demand for them.
Thank you. Final question that's come in is, do we know the actual percentage of people who rent versus own a home in Colorado?
Yes, we do. And I don't have that at my fingertips, but Brian, we can get that to you,
okay,
maybe even before the end of the call here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris. If you all have more questions, please throw them in the chat, and I'll ask either.
Brian, I do have one more question that came directly to me. And this might actually be something for the Division of Housing folks as well, but Chris, if you can answer, that'd be great. Marilyn was wondering if there are any funding opportunities for ag work housing, agricultural, especially for migrant or part of the year agricultural worker housing.
Yeah, Philip, you were cutting out there a little bit, but I think you said ag worker.
AG, agricultural,
migrant,
yes.
Yeah, migrant, farm worker, ag worker, yes. Yes, we absolutely, with all the same resources that I've already mentioned, tax credits, private activity bonds, our HOF fund, the Division of Housing, which Allison can speak much more clearly to, has been a partner in several of those transactions, but we've done more than significantly more than a handful over the years. So the short answer is yes, those resources do exist for that community.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you everyone for your questions. These are very helpful. And we'll now turn it over to Allison George from the Division of Housing. We're going to talk about what they're up to, and then Andrew Paredes as well. We'll talk about federal and state stimulus funds. So Allison, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Chris. That was very informative. And so we work together with CHFA daily. And so you'll find that we build off of each other with our presentations. Philip, can you advance the slide, please? So I'm Allison George. I'm the director for the Division of Housing. And the Division of Housing was actually created in 1970 to improve access for all Coloradans to decent, affordable housing. Last year, so I talk in fiscal years, state fiscal years. And so last year, we had our biggest year. Philip, can you advance the slide, please? We served over 73,000 households. In most industries, talking about such increases, it's a great thing. We serve so many households because of COVID-19. 29,000 of those households were through our housing relief programs. So today I'm going to be talking through the 5 different offices that we have in the Division of Housing, what they did in the last year in partnership with communities and nonprofits and developers around the state, housing authorities, you name it, around the state, to try to keep Coloradans safe and stably housed in the last year. I'm also going to be talking about what the headwinds are. All of us, and I know you all feel it on a daily basis, there are things that we're challenged by as we're doing this work. But then also talking about the opportunities. And Andrew, I think, is going to jump more into the opportunities. I'm gonna kind of set the stage, I guess. So we are a statewide housing authority. We manage almost 9,000 vouchers now around the state. So leased and issued vouchers, almost 9,000. I mentioned the 73,000 households that we serve. This is all of our programs through our 5 different offices. And in our Housing Finance and Sustainability Office, which Andrew Perez is the director of, we created 43 new housing opportunities for new people, or for people, excuse me, needing affordable housing. Philip? Thank you. We also have the Office of Homeless Initiatives. And so from our Office of Homeless Initiatives, we housed over 1,000 people from homelessness into housing, a roof over their heads. We also have the Fort Lyon effort, where we housed people coming from homelessness with issues with substance use, 340 people. This program was really impacted with COVID because as we have people coming in and out, we need to ensure that we had the social distancing to keep people safe. And we didn't want an outbreak in Bent County, where Fort Lyon is located. 61% of the people in the Fort Lyon program did exit to secured permanent and transitional housing with that program. Next slide, please. So going back to our voucher programs, the almost 9,000 vouchers now, 83% of the people we serve through those programs are people with disabilities. And so that's a very unique thing as a housing authority. And we do that because of our partnerships that we have around the states. Not only are we partnered with housing authorities, but we're also partnered with community mental health centers and other nonprofits around the state to administer those vouchers. We have a community access team, and so we are partnered with the HCPF, which is Medicaid agency, and we work to ensure people have accessibility in their homes. So we can actually review the modifications that somebody needs in order to stay in their home rather than going to a more costly nursing home. And so this allows people to live in their community, stay where they know their neighbors, where they know their family is. So 639 households through that program. And then we also have our Office of Regulatory Oversight. And so through this office, we do a couple of things. One is we do safety inspections for factory-built housing. And so we did 268 of these construction and safety inspections. And this is even during COVID, where we were even more challenged in getting folks out for that. I also want to note, and it's not on this slide, but this is also the team that has the mobile home park oversight. And so through that program, we did 720, we did technical assistance for owners of mobile home parks and registrations for 720 parks. We also turned on a new landlord-tenant conflict resolution for mobile home parks, very specific to mobile home parks. I want to make sure that that's there. So we received 157 complaints that we worked through, or that we are working through with both landlords, property owners, and the residents in the properties. Next slide, please. So starting to get into some of the headwinds. The 29,000 households that we supported through emergency rental assistance, through emergency mortgage assistance. Andrew will go a little bit more into detail into this, but this was through many sources. This was through executive orders. This was through emergency funds. This is through CARES Act funds. This is through special session funds through the legislature. This is through the more recent federal legislation, HR 133, and then now the American Rescue Plan. And so these things are all in operation. $143 million since the beginning of the pandemic. This is staggering. And I want to stop here for just a second because this has been in the news quite a bit about the speed of payment and trying to keep people housed. As we have adjusted from program to program, the most recent program, ERA or ERAP, we do have an online application. We have been challenged. We started the program with the state's traditional payment mechanism, which is by checks. Checks are really hard. And I will just leave that at that because they go out in the mail. They either make it to their recipient or they eventually come back. So we recently, in an effort to improve transparency and improve payment processing, have transitioned to Bill.com. And so applications that have been approved, landlords that have been approved, can now register, and you will get your unique application to do this, but can register with Bill.com to receive electronic payment. And so this will be much easier for you to track, much easier for us to track through the system. So with that said, it's been in operation for a couple of weeks, and at this point in time, we have about 2,100 applications that are approved and pending payment. Of that, 16.2 million of outstanding payments. 70% of those are from August, that have been approved in August. So I just wanted to make sure that folks know that we are working to improve this program daily, weekly, and we're really excited. We're very excited, I should say, for this transition to Bill.com because the check process that we had been going through was very challenging, and we're very happy to be making this transition. And we're hoping that our clients, landlords, tenants are seeing the improvements as we make that transition. Next slide, please. So let's talk about headwinds. Oops. Oh, back, please. Oh, did we go forward too fast? Oh, we went forward too fast. Okay, sorry. I'll go back to, thank you, Philip. So the challenges and past and future. We knew we had a housing crisis before the pandemic. It's not a surprise to all of us that work in the housing world. The pandemic has really put those issues that we all knew existed right there in front of everyone. And so let's talk about the headwinds. Philip, please. Okay, so Chris was talking about the huge jump in values of properties, the huge jump of cost, the huge jump in rents. Why? So what this slide is showing the deficit of construction by decade, starting in 1939, actually. So renter occupied is blue and owner occupied is gray. And you can see what housing stock, this is not cumulative, I should say. So this is what existed, what was built during that decade. And you can see that we had a 40% drop in production in the last 10 years. This is a huge point to make of why costs have increased so much. Because you know people are still moving to Colorado. We all know this is the best state. And other people are noticing that as well. And so of course they're going to be moving to Colorado, and we are not keeping up with the demand. We're not keeping up with the demand on any level. And that is the challenge that we are all faced with. Next slide, please. And then you have the pandemic. So this is the pulse survey that the US Census Bureau does. And so on a monthly basis, we look at people's confidence in how they're going to pay their housing costs next month, this month. The challenge with this survey, I will tell you, is that we actually, or the survey, the Census Bureau did not collect this information before the pandemic. This survey started during the pandemic. And so to know how it compares to 3 years ago, people may not have been very confident about how they were going to pay next month's rent 3 years ago. But we don't have that as a baseline. But what we can tell now is the top bar shows no confidence and ability to pay for housing next month, 117,000 households. That's significant. Just so that you can see as well, the gray bar that kind of follows the line, that's the confidence error. So it's somewhere between that gray line or the gray box. The second bar, not caught up on housing payment or did not pay last month, 195,000 households. These are the people that should be applying for rental assistance. Somewhat very likely to leave housing due to eviction or foreclosure. This is the bottom line, 79,000 households. These are our headwinds. These are the challenges that all of you, what we're facing. And this is why these partnerships at the local level, like Chris talked about, the partnerships at the state level are so important so that we can have the best impact that we can with the resources that we have. Next slide, please. So let's get into the more exciting stuff, the stuff that's not quite as depressing. Let's talk about how we can solve some of this. So back in 2019, we thought that was an enormous year. And so what this slide shows is it shows the funding that was advocated for in 2019. That money is starting to be seen. So again, we talk in fiscal years. So the second bar to the left shows that we received 11 million in tobacco tax toward the very end of June, excuse me. We also received 11 million in vendor fee. So the vendor fee that was approved in 2019 started flowing in the spring. So we've started making awards using those dollars. Very exciting. Additionally, we expect to actually get $55 million of vendor fee this year. It's flowing now on a monthly basis. And so this is the first time we're starting to see that effort from 2019 happening. So the tobacco tax actually will happen for 3 years. And the vendor fee is into the far future. There's not an end date. So this is very exciting. And we're not even talking about stimulus dollars right now. But what I do want to do is I want to take a step back and I want to talk about, and I'm actually going to transition soon to Andrew, because in order to plan for the vendor fee and the unclaimed assets, which are not on here because they have not been transferred, like Brian mentioned, I want to talk about how we started planning for the vendor fee, because we knew the vendor fee was going to start flowing sometime, but we just didn't, we needed to get a better idea of the timing. And so what we did together with Housing Colorado and CHFA was we did the engagement sessions around the state. And from that, there is a stakeholder engagement report that's on our website. If you haven't seen it, please go to our website and you can find that in the report section. But in that stakeholder engagement effort, the recommendation for a strategic housing working group was formed. And so with, I believe, the next slide, yes, I'm going to transition it to Andrew Paredes, our Director of our Housing Finance and Sustainability, and hand it off to him, because the Strategic Housing Working Group was really aimed at what can we do? What does Colorado need with these new dollars coming into the state? And so I think it also can help inform the talk with the stimulus dollars. So I think the timing of it is great because the report just came out in July. So Andrew, I don't know if you want to dive into this.
Thanks, Allison. So yes, as part of all these new state resources that are coming online now, the vendor fee, et cetera, we went out and sought applications and formed a strategic housing working group, who you can see we had a great response and got 12 great individuals from across the state representing different parts of the state's geography, as well as different parts of the housing industry and different constituencies, tenancies, and homeownership constituencies. So it was a really good, diverse group that came together to take a look at the overall housing landscape around the state and identify what this group thought were priority housing needs. As you can see here, much of this we kind of know, and we all either know, for sure or intuitively our needs and challenges facing the state. So the group started meeting in November of 2020, and we had 6 meetings, I believe, that concluded in July and presented the report to our state housing board in July, as well as to the governor's office and to the legislature. As Allison said, the report was requested by the interim committees working on these stimulus dollars to kind of kick off the conversation in terms of priorities. Next slide, please. So after identifying the priorities and the areas of need, the Strategic Housing Working Group got together and came up with some recommendations as to what might be done to address some of these needs. And you can see on the right there, the recommendations were really good, I thought. Certainly, there was a group that recommended that the state take a look at its levels of funding to housing projects around accessibility and universal design. Could the state provide more funding than just the required minimum to developers to incent them to build even more units that are accessible? Secondly, capital and capacity. The group recommended that both that the state provide more assistance in terms of funds, as well as technical assistance to smaller areas and smaller nonprofits around the state, both to build their capital in order to do more affordable housing projects, as well as their capacity to help build their expertise, help provide, funding perhaps for more staff or give them access to different maybe consultants around the state. In addition, some specific recommendations about capital capacity were that the state ought to go back and take a look at our guidelines for per unit funding amounts and AMIs served, and try to get away from a one size fits all approach to funding statewide. So perhaps ways that we've been underwriting projects in, say, the Front Range as opposed to the San Luis Valley might be different. They're definitely different areas of the state. We have to go back and take a look at how we're approaching that. Perhaps there ought to be different guidelines and metrics for different parts of the state, both in terms of dollar amounts, as well as the populations or the income populations served. Rental assistance programs. There was a recommendation that the state do the most it can. Sometimes our hands are tied at the state in terms of federal kind of mandates to admin dollars for voucher administration, but for us to take a look at our rental assistance programs and see what additional assistance we can provide our partner agencies to deploy these vouchers or these programs. What can we do to preserve naturally occurring affordable housing or incent some of our nonprofit developers or maybe even sellers of existing apartment buildings to sell properties to nonprofit developers, affordable housing developers, or housing authorities to try and keep them out of the hands of the market rate fix and flippers, so to speak, who will take some existing affordable projects and take them out of the affordable pool. Zoning and land use. This was pretty exciting. I'm not long into state government, but from what I've heard, kind of a first. We started working on this project in November of 2020, and there was a group that wanted to take on zoning and land use as maybe a headwind or an idea that could help promote more affordable housing. That conversation got started in November, really got some legs with a subgroup in January, and actually made its way to legislation before the end of the session, before the report was even finalized and produced for the State Housing Board. This was really the genesis and the birth of Housing Bill 1271. I believe it was the number that is now law. And so this strategic housing working group really had a huge impact even before its final report was produced. And to wrap up, there were a couple of recommendations around providing more support for services in our affordable housing developments, both traditional supportive housing services, as well as, can and should we look at kind of ad hoc services to higher income bands than traditional PSH, but certainly, lower than market rate. Do our affordable housing projects, could they come with some services to help tenants? And then to bolster our programs around housing rehabilitation, can we keep people housed in their current situation? Maybe there are low to moderate income families who are in houses and maybe they paid the mortgages off, living on a fixed income, but need some assistance to fix that house up so that they don't have to move because the heater breaks or the roof is leaking. In addition to what can we do to promote more home ownership kind of down the income scale? As we saw from Chris's slides, home ownership, just even in the last 6 months, is mushrooming kind of out of control and out of reach of moderate income families. So can we expand our thinking in terms of down payment assistance to provide assistance to moderate income families to be able to reach up the ladder into home ownership? Next slide, please. So from there, I'll take a pause and ask for questions for me or for Allison before we dive into the stimulus programs.
Andrew, I see one question here. What groups are working on preservation?
So at the moment, we have a good working group, a partnership between CHFA and DOH to try and develop. This is a great segue question too into the stimulus funds, but to try and develop a financing tool that will allow our partner agencies, be they housing authorities, nonprofits, or perhaps even for-profit affordable housing developers, be able to go in and compete to buy existing NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing properties, and keep them in the affordable stack. So if there are other groups out there that would love to help to work on this, or just to give voice to this effort, please contact me, and I'd love to chat with you to see how we can work together.
I think that question is a great segue, like you said, to stimulus. Actually, one other question just popped in the chat, and I'll have you answer this and then talk about stimulus. Are there any funds available for housing infrastructure, which was a topic of discussion in the outreach work completed before funding arrived?
Yes, and our statute as part of, I think it was, what we call the vendor fee and the unclaimed asset additions to our DOH statute, specifically added the ability for us to use our new state funds to help fund infrastructure projects for parcels that will become affordable housing. So yes, not only talk, but actually that's been kind of codified in statute, and we are ready to look at and take applications with that in mind.
And sorry, Andrew, a couple more questions have
No
popped
problem.
in the chat. Has anyone explored proposing a bill to create property tax exemption for retirees on fixed incomes? Is this even a reasonable idea? I haven't heard of that coming up, but it's certainly something to explore. And then Sue asks, are you funding home ownership development for restricted housing or mostly to help existing homeowners?
So the programs we are considering in terms of home ownership development are both down payment assistance to help new and aspiring homeowners, or perhaps homeowners that have been priced out of their current home but need to shift to a different home, as well as assistance to fund the development of home ownership opportunities. So that would be with, think land trusts, think, the Habitat for Humanity model, or other locally based models that want to build and develop developments. It's very redundant, but to build and develop projects for home ownership that need some support or subsidy going in on the front end before those houses are completed and then sold to the LMI homeowners we're trying to target. So I'd say, Brian, or Sue, I'd say we'd like to attack that from both sides, both the supply and the demand side of that equation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew. Let you transition now into stimulus. Boy, the big millions of dollar question.
Thank you. And thank you, Philip. Yes. So as Allison mentioned, we had two federal stimulus programs hit in the last 9 months. The HR 133, which was the very first kind of Biden stimulus, and then the American Recovery Plan Act, or ARPA, which was signed in March. And ARPA was kind of the big one that provided, big chunks of money to the state for affordable housing. So what do we know in terms of ARPA? Well, it allocated approximately $500 million for affordable housing to the state of Colorado. The legislature, through House Bill 1329, essentially created a holding fund that receipted those $500 million into the state, and then immediately allocated or appropriated $98.5 million to DOH to roll out, or to get out as quickly as possible to promote the continued development of affordable housing projects, and if possible, jumpstart any of these shovel-ready projects. In addition, there was a small earmark to eviction legal defense, so that program is continuing as well. And then the remaining $400 million is being retained for a year at the legislature's level in that holding fund, while they are going through the interim committee or interim task force process this summer to receive feedback from all over the state, stakeholders, constituents, partner agencies, to inform the legislature on the greatest needs. And the legislature will take that all into account and appropriate that money coming up in the next session or sessions. Further, $305 million was allocated to the state to continue emergency rental assistance. So that builds on the $385 million that was already in the state from HR 133, an additional $305 million to get us almost to $700 million of emergency rental assistance resources to be able to deploy. This program really started, as Allison said, last summer as with a $3 million earmark at the state level from the Disaster Emergency Fund, thinking that we could use some rental assistance for a couple months. And that evolved into the CARES Act, which we thought might get us through the first few months, maybe through the end of 2020 when we'd really need it. And as we all know, the pandemic and the economic ramifications are proving to last far longer than that, and will last for years to come. So this additional $305 million really bolsters the rental assistance opportunity and programs for the next several years. Further, the $175 million has been allocated to Colorado for the Homeowner Assistance Fund, or HAF. This is, in very broad terms, the sister program to emergency rental assistance. This is emergency mortgage assistance. So we at the state have received the first 10% of that money, or $17 million, that we will be rolling out very soon to create the EMAP, the Emergency Mortgage Assistance Program, the sister program to ERAP, so that folks who are coming off of mortgage forbearance, which ends at the end of September, can now begin to apply for monthly mortgage assistance to make sure that nobody will be displaced from their home due to foreclosure. And then the remaining $158 million, we have gone through a stakeholder and citizen engagement process, and will be publishing the state's overall homeowner assistance fund plans in the very near future. We also were lucky enough to receive 1,000 new emergency housing vouchers, which we've been able to get out on the street, and we've been allocated $66 million of additional home ARP or TVRA funds, both to entitlement communities, the largest cities and counties around the state, as well as to DOH to administer statewide. We're waiting on, we have the award. We are waiting on HUD to publish guidelines so that we can get that money out onto the street. Next slide, please. So what we know in terms of some of the first state stimulus bills that have been passed with that ARP money. Senate Bill 242 was passed this last session, which earmarked $30 million to DOH for the master lease or purchase of existing underutilized hotels and motels for affordable housing to help those currently experiencing homelessness or at imminent risk of becoming homeless. So we will be publishing a NOFA hopefully by the end of this week, that will solicit applications to dip into this money for nonprofits, governments, or housing authorities to come to the state to quickly apply for and be awarded funds to go out and purchase these assets as quickly as possible, with the eye towards tying them up, locking them up, being owned by our nonprofit partners, and then take a moment to be able to put kind of the long-term capital stack that Chris described into place. But we want a quick strike fund that will allow folks to buy these hotels, motels, or to master lease these hotels and motels quickly, get them under control, and then kind of put in the long-term or the permanent plan. In addition, House Bill 1271 was passed, and at the department level, the Department of Local Affairs, primarily through our sister agency, the Division of Local Government, will be publishing tomorrow guidelines for its $48 million Innovative Affordable Housing Strategies Program. So that is the Innovative Land Use Grant, the Planning Grant, and the Affordable Housing Toolkit. We will be publishing the guidelines tomorrow for these three programs, and the first two of which, the Innovative, sorry about that, the, need to get to my notes. The Innovative Land Use Strategies Grant, as well as the Planning Development Grant, will begin to take applications in November. And then we at DOH will be following up with an application timeline for the Affordable Housing Toolkit later on in this calendar year, October, November of 2021. Next, please. I'm also very happy to announce that we have also been able to roll out our House Bill 1329 programs, kind of hand in hand with our Senate Bill 242 Hotel Motel Acquisition, NOFA. We will, in the same notice of funding or funding availability, be seeking applications for more than just hotels, motels, and homelessness strategy properties, but for other properties, an acquisition fund, so that if one of our partner agencies is able to identify, say, that NOAA property or even raw land that that can be acquired to build the housing portfolio, we want to open this fund up for those uses as well. Again, it's intended as kind of a quick strike fund that will allow our partners to go out, purchase these assets, and then take a moment and put the sensible or the long-term capital stack in place. So this fund is really envisioned to be a loan fund where, you know, kind of the garden variety, say an agency would come to us and say, we've identified this tract of land that we'd like to buy. We want to beat the development community to the punch. We might lend up to, you know, 95, 100% of acquisition price so that our partners can go out and buy this land. The interest rate would be little to none, so very nominal, and there wouldn't be necessarily any payments required. But we just want to control the land, then go in and put together the long-term capital stack, which might include tax credits. It might also include a DOH gap funding grant that will be put in place to do the long-term financing. And then that money would be used to pay back this acquisition fund. So maybe 3 years from now, another agency or community can dip back into this fund to do this whole thing again. We're also going to be soliciting a notice of application from partner investment funds, affordable housing investment funds that are already existing. You know, Chris mentioned CHFA has a couple of initiatives. That'd be the kind of fund that we'd like to perhaps provide capital to allow them to continue to do their good work. We know that there are other funds out there in the state that are already doing this, and we'd love to be able to supply capital to them so that they can increase their horsepower and go out and fund or underwrite more projects that are already in their pipelines. And then lastly, we will be partnering with CHFA in their what they call the round one, or the 9% tax credit round, early next year, to stretch out the tax credits, so kind of increase the horsepower. I'm going to talk in very broad terms now, but if there are in any given year 30 applications to a competitive tax credit round, and through underwriting and analysis, perhaps there are 12 to 15 applications that are very good that CHFA and DOH would love to partner with and fund. But because that's a limited resource, there can only be 10 awards in years past. We'd love to add a supplemental grant that perhaps could stretch that out from 10 awards to 12 or 15 awards by combining maybe a smaller amount of tax credit with a supplemental grant through these funds. Again, so that we can promote the development of good projects that are ready to go. We hate it when we see 15 great applications but only can fund 10. So that's the very broad-based idea. We will be partnering with CHFA through the tax credit advisory group and through further kind of stakeholder listening sessions, how to build that program out, and take feedback how to do it as expeditiously but also thoughtfully as possible. Next slide, please. We have also rolled out our Office of Housing Recovery. So this is a new group within DOH to oversee both our emergency rental assistance programs as well as our homeowner assistance fund programs. And we were lucky in the last couple weeks to bring on board Sarah Buss, who is the new director of this office, as well as to bring on board our first three employees of the HRO, our asset managers, and we will be looking to continue to staff out this office. I think it's notable to take a moment and look back and think back about what DOH has been able to do over the last 15 months. As Allison mentioned, we have been able to get out $141 million of assistance, by and large, with the existing staff that was at DOH in February of 2020, prior to the pandemic. Now, a lot of folks put in a lot of great work, both working day in and day out on pandemic response or kind of picking up some of the regular work slack that necessarily came with having our coworkers' job shifted somewhere else. That work had to continue to be done. So we did a lot of work with the existing staff on site, and we're so happy now that we're able to bring on more folks through the Housing Recovery Office to pick that up and run with it, and allow our existing staff to kind of get back to what we have been doing, and also to all the opportunities with these new sources. So very happy that we're bringing the Housing Recovery Office online at the moment. Next, please. And then I talked about it a little bit a moment ago, the homeowner assistance funds, or the HAF, what our plans are. I said, as I said, we're rolling out the EMAP program as quickly as possible. We will be using Neighborly software, the same software and application portal that our rental programs are using. Our mortgage programs will use as well, so that we can get that up and running as quickly as possible. That program will cover kind of monthly mortgage assistance, as well as other housing costs, HOA fees, perhaps property taxes, homeowners insurance, those fees that could put someone at risk of losing their housing right away. And then our larger HAF plan will use the remaining $158 million to build out a mortgage counseling program, similar to what was done 10 years ago in the foreclosure crisis. It seems like if you're a mortgage borrower, there are a lot of different programs, terminology, assistance out there. It could be pretty confusing to call your mortgage company and ask, what loss mitigation program do I apply for? What partial claim should I ask for? What is the difference between forbearance and foreclosure? So we'd like to build out a robust counseling program to help people with that. Home equity recovery program. So this is designed to make sure all Coloradans are kind of treated fairly. For the most part, most mortgages that are covered by federal programs, FHA, VA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, most of those borrowers have access to federal loss mitigation or partial claim programs, that if a person wasn't able to pay their mortgage for the last year, October 1st, they're not faced with a $20,000 payment notice. Most of those programs will allow folks to take that $20,000 owed and tack it on to the back of their mortgage in what we call a silent second. So that could be paid back when they sell their house. No interest accrues, no payments are due. But for folks that don't have those kind of mortgages, or their bank isn't treating them fairly, we want to set up a state funded program through these HAF dollars to also allow them to not have to pay that $20,000 check, October 1st, or fear of being kicked out of their house, to allow them to also have a silent second. And we'd love for all of these programs not to affect people if and when they have to go sell their house. We don't want that to put them in a negative equity situation. So we're building the program out with that in mind. In addition to using some of this money to bolster our home rehabilitation programs and assisting folks who might be able to refinance their existing first mortgage, get a lower payment so that they can continue to afford their mortgages And if they deal with an agency or a down payment assistance program that isn't able to subordinate, we can use some of these half dollars to help make that happen, so that a homeowner doesn't lose out on the ability to get a better interest rate and a better payment because of kind of the silent second they might have hanging on to the back of their loan. With that, I will take questions.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to suggest that we try and answer the questions in the chat because we're running about a half an hour behind. So I'd like to invite Andrew or folks at DOH to answer some of the questions that are in the chat, to do those in the chat. And then we're going to take just a 5-minute break stretch. We'll come back at 11:35 and break up into small discussion groups by topic. And we'll adjust the schedule accordingly so that we can get you all out of here at 12:30. But take a 5-minute break. Be back at 11:35. Thank you all very much.
Andrew, I'll start from the bottom if you want to start from the top. That way we don't answer the same questions.
Yep, sounds good. And I'm addressing each person in my answer so that you can see which question I'm starting to answer.
Gotcha. Okay.
Not sure if you guys realize that you're on.
Yes, thank
Hi.
you.
Yep.
Rather than text, we're just talking. Thank you.
Okay, that's cool. I just didn't know.
Thank you, Cheryl.
You're
And
welcome.
Allison, I guess I was muted. You saw that I said I'm going to start from the top.
I'm just eavesdropping.
It's always nice to see faces.
And Allison and Andrew, Kristen Toombs here. Let me know if there are any you see that I could be helpful in answering.
If you want to do the 242 questions, I saw a couple for people faced with homelessness. So if you want to
I'll look for
tackle-
those.
Thank
Okay,
you.
sure.